So interviewer Botter Milligan is a project manager by day and a podcast creator by night. Since 2012, he has been vocal in sharing his interests with the world and amplifying the stories of others. He's the creator and host of the award-winning podcast, The Short Box, a comic book talk show, and recently launched the Next Spin podcast for music lovers. In 2018, he helped form the Jax Podcasters United Group, a collective of podcasters and audio creators dedicated to helping one another through collaboration and community. Botter is also an FSCJ alumnus and a veteran of the Florida Air National Guard, using both experiences to run his own small business, the Short Box Entertainment Company. So Botter, I'll hand it over to you.
Duval Comic and Zine Fest 2023. How are we feeling today? That was a commendable effort. That was like a C-. And I know that we're just getting to know each other, so I don't want to come off as pushy already, but there's a lot of very important people here that can help to ensure that events like this continue to happen. The only thing they need is just to hear it and believe it. So with that in mind, let's try that one more time. Duval Comic and Zine Fest 2023, how are we doing? Much better. That's the type of energy that we need here today. We are here today at the Duval Comic and Zine Fest celebrating the spirit of self-publishing and just being surrounded by some of the best zine and comic creators in all of Florida. But if I'm being honest, out of everyone here, you guys are my favorite, because you guys have taken time from all of the incredible creators we got here and all the awesome zines for sale to, sit down and dedicate some time to this awesome lit chat that we got for you guys, which speaks to your willpower, because I don't know if I could have done it. So I appreciate it. And I know that our esteemed guest appreciates it, which brings me to our main event. Your Lit Chat author joining us today won her first award for comics in college for her first graphic novel, Queen's Day. Since then, she's been nominated for several high-profile industry awards. Her comics have been published in magazines all over the world. Her resume includes well-respected bodies of work like the powerfully honest graphic novel Unterzakhn and latest short comics collection called You Are Not a Ghost. And when she's not expressing her life and the world around her through art, she's preaching the gospel of comics and what they're capable of. As a teacher at the Sequential Artist Workshop in Gainesville, Florida, and as an adjunct professor at UF College of Fine Arts. We could spend all day talking about her accolades, but I think it's best that you hear it from her yourself. DCAZ 2023, without further ado, I'm honored to welcome Leela Corman to the stage.
Thank you for that great introduction, Botter. I want to issue a couple of small corrections.
Please.
My latest collection is called You Are Not a Guest.
Oh.
Yeah.
That was on me.
And I am now teaching at RISD, not UF. I have left UF, but that's the thing we could talk about.
See, I should have paid for the subscription to keep up with all the great stuff you're doing. You just change it so quick.
Yeah, my imaginary Substack. I don't update people often enough, especially since the pandemic. I've just been sort of spotty in how much I update my website and stuff like that. So that is probably the most updated bio that's floating around on the internet, and it's up to me to rewrite it. So. Well,
I appreciate the pass. Leela, do you reside in Gainesville now? Is that correct?
So we actually left Gainesville in 2020.
Oh, okay.
We live in Providence, Rhode Island now.
Okay.
My husband, Tom Hart, who founded Sequential Artist Workshop, and our daughter.
Okay.
But, yay! Hi!
I thought that was your daughter for a minute. I was like, wow, got a very burly voice.
She can project. SAW is still operating in Gainesville, and they're awesome, and shout yourselves out again.
Woo! There we go.
Love you guys.
But you were born in Massachusetts, correct?
Yeah, well, I was born in this particular hospital in Massachusetts where all of the macrobiotic commune women had their babies because my mother lived in a macrobiotic house. in the early 70s. This is like very Cambridge, Massachusetts in the early 70s. And I just met someone, my friend's partner was born like 3 days after me in the same hospital because her parents were also in that community. Yeah.
What do you remember from, what was the comic or zine community or scene like in Massachusetts as best as you can remember?
Well, so I should be really clear. I grew up in New York City.
There we go.
And so when I started reading comics as a teenager, you know, like a lot of kids, I read Archie and, you know, Harvey comics. I really loved Harvey comics. I still
Classics.
do. Yeah, so good. A big influence on a lot of indie cartoonists too, and Archie as well. And then I just kind of put them away for a while, like I think a lot of us probably do. And then I found them again as a teenager because a friend of mine had a book by Bill Griffith, a Zippy the Pinhead book called Are We Having Fun Yet? And that was like the big explosive. You had asked in your list of questions that you sent me earlier about the first comic that I read that really
resonated.
Me. Yeah, it was that. And then I quickly discovered, so to take back to your question about what the comic scene was like, in New York in the late 80s there was an amazing weird store called Soho Zat that had like used records and old postcards and it was like junky and great in an old warehouse. And they had a ton of comics, of underground comics. So that's where I found Love and Rockets and whatever last gasp or Fantagraphics were publishing in late 1980s, early 90s. And so that was like my really kind of like, that's what pulled me back in. And then I found Raw, and Raw dropped into my life like a bomb and detonated. And that was like a ticket to the future, like this is what you're going to do with the rest of your life.
Wow.
Then I went to art school and had it beaten out of me for a while, but I came back. Yeah.
Now, when you say beaten out of you, is it just because was the attitude or the instructors, did they view comics maybe as a lesser form? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, it was a combination of things. So the first thing was that I always really wanted to be a painter. So I just naturally was not really, you know, comics were like this thing I was reading, and then I was studying painting and printmaking and performance art and trying a whole bunch of different things. When I started making comics, that's when I discovered how unpopular it was in art schools at the time. This is not true anymore as far as I know. I mean, is anybody in the audience in school or recently in school? And is it better now?
I see a little hand to the left right there, so one of them.
I see a nod, yeah. So in the 90s, if you were making comics in art school, you would be told to stop. And there was no education for it outside of mainstream comics. And it's better now. And I think institutionalizing comics educationally has its own set of issues, but it's definitely infinitely better to be able to study it formally if you can, if you want to. You don't have to. And that's the thing. So when you asked about what the comic scene was like in Massachusetts, in Boston and Cambridge in the 90s, and in every other city in the US as well, there were groups of us just teaching ourselves how to make comics. I think this was especially true for the women who were making comics, but I think it's true for everybody too. We taught ourselves, and we were publishing them ourselves. You know, no one told me to buy a 12-inch stapler. I somehow figured out that that's what I needed. Like, I didn't have mentors or anybody to tell me how to do it. I had to just kind of like blindly find my way. But then I discovered that a whole bunch of us, other people, had blindly found their way, and we found each other.
Good answer. On the topic of academia, you know, I brought up that your time as an instructor, or it sounds still current, right? Still currently teaching?
I'm still currently teaching, yeah.
So, well, specifically as your time as an instructor in Gainesville as part of the Sequential Arts Workshop, I guess, would you be able to quantify or give us a snapshot of what comic and zine culture like is in Florida through the work of students? Like, did you notice like a common theme or maybe like an artistic style that's maybe like unique to Florida through your time as an instructor?
Actually, no. I would say no. I would say everybody's very individual, and that's, I think, our strength. And at SAW in general, that's our strength. So I should clarify, I still teach at SAW online.
Oh, okay.
And so we have a lot of students from all over the world who come to our online classes, And then we have people from all over the world who come in person and from all over the state. I think Gainesville's always been a bit of a refuge in Florida for, like, if you're a weirdo, you can go there and be your weirdo self. And SAW has really, I think, been a part of that too. What I see is a tremendous amount of individual expression. And that's something that as teachers at SAW, we all really encourage.
And I guess that'd be, I've always viewed comics as the ultimate artistic medium because it can just adapt to any story, any genre. I mean, do you feel the same way? Because I'm kind of getting that vibe when you say that, you know, there was no one way to pinpoint, like, you know, to sum it up. It sounds like maybe that you got to experience that too through teaching, that, you know, comics being a vehicle for all.
Yes, I'm so glad that you said that. And that was actually something that, well before I even thought I would ever teach or even make comics, something that I really felt about the medium. You can say anything. You can do anything. You can utilize any formal style, drawing, painting, any materials. Almost anything can be a comic, and I'm actually really interested in pushing the form even further now than I was back then. But when I was coming up, I was reading a lot of Phoebe Gloeckner, Julie Doucet, people who were in Twisted Sisters especially, and a lot of French comic book artists, and seeing just like there's so many approaches to this art form. So yeah, I think that has to have influenced my teaching pedagogy. It's not something I've been super explicit about as a teacher, but I think I'm probably going to start talking about that more. I think if I haven't been explicit about it in my classes, it's because at SAW, at least, I think everybody comes in understanding that. In other teaching environments, I do have to say it a little more straightforwardly.
You brought up looking towards French comics, and I mentioned earlier that your work has been published in different countries, in different languages. I think it's like Unterzakhn has been published or translated in Spanish, Dutch, French. And I was curious, how often do you, I guess, what's your experience with European comics or comics from an international background? Like, do you ever look at those and find new ways to tell stories through the medium?
Yeah, definitely. And also a whole lot of good creative envy. Like, God, I wish I could make something that looks like this, feels like this. The first time I went to France as a cartoonist was 1999, 2000, to Angoulême. And it was like stepping through the looking glass. Like, they treated us like rock stars.
Wow.
If somebody found out you were a cartoonist, they'd be like, oh, wow, here's a glass of wine. Would you like a cappuccino? You know, like, people are very, they call it the ninth art. It's very respected. And at that time, it was not here. That has changed, but there's a very sophisticated comics culture in Francophone countries, which also means, like, there are a whole lot of amazing comics coming out of Francophone countries in Africa. Belgian comics are amazing. There's actually sophisticated comics cultures everywhere. There's, like, amazing comics in Arabic, in Spanish, in all over the world. So when you leave the lens of American comics and you just look to international, not only French but everywhere, you see people doing things with the medium that might not have occurred to us. It's just, I love that.
Can you recall, like, one specific example of seeing something done maybe in an international or European comic that you're like, you know, I'm going to try to adopt that or give my own spin to it? I'm not seeing that too much here in American comics. I'm
not so sure I could say that I had a conscious, I want to do that kind of reaction, but as you ask me, the story that comes immediately to mind is a Jacques Tardy story called The Murderer of Hung, which was actually set in New York Chinatown at a time when I was a teenager, so I remember that particular landscape, and it's gone now. That particular streetscape, some of the signs were in that comic. And I'm going to get some of these details wrong because it's been a long time since I read that story, but as I remember it, it is a Vietnamese woman recounting her son's death, her young son's death during the war at the hands of American soldiers. And Jacques Tardy has this very loose, beautiful inking style. And the combination of talking about something extremely serious and the amount of black and the technical stuff that he's doing in that comic really stuck with me. But I would say for the things that I wanted to do, the comics that really made me go, I want to try to emulate that, probably more like certainly Jaime Hernandez and Gilbert Hernandez, huge influences on me. Like, I could never say that enough. My books are full of homages to them. And also, I'm a very classically trained artist, so there's a lot of non-comics art that comes into my work, too.
The Hernandez brothers is, I mean, what can you say about them? Those guys are role models to a range of incredible artists. So those are great inspirations. Leela, your work, in my opinion, has like a real cinematic and like German expressionist style to it. You know, it's raw, it's honest, and the way your layouts are, it reminds me of like storyboarding. And I feel like your stories, especially I read Unterzakhn in prep, and I was like, man, this would really work as a documentary or as a live action interpretation. But it's clear as day that sequential storytelling is your preferred medium. And I read somewhere that you described, you said that comics were the most difficult art form I've ever attempted. And I was curious, why so? And why, and how did you land on sequential storytelling as like your preferred medium? And, considering that you're a classically trained artist and there's so many other, ways to bring your story to life.
That's a great question. There's a lot of answers to that, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can be. So I'm a classically trained artist who had some bad experiences in art school that kind of pushed me away from the path that I wanted to be on. And I'm kind of a rebellious person by nature, so my reaction to that was kind of, well, okay, I'm going to go somewhere you can't follow and make comics instead. But also I really wanted to make comics. When I would read Love and Rockets, I just feel like, I'm just dying to make something like this, but this looks so difficult. And it wasn't until I started to see original comic art pages that I realized, human beings made this. I can see mistakes, and I could do this too. And then it just sort of snowballed when I started making them. There were a lot of other things that happened, and I'll spare everybody the full biographical details, but I've come to a point now where I'm really comfortably marrying my painting training with my cartooning. And I'm a big fan of German Expressionism, and also the movement that followed immediately after the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity painting, is a huge influence on me, which you're going to see in my next book, which is not out yet, Victory Parade, where I actually straight up just copied an Otto Dix painting as one of the panels. So the new objectivity artists were painters and printmakers who were working in Weimar-era Germany, mostly Berlin. If you're familiar with the Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937, who here knows what I'm talking about? The Degenerate Art Exhibition. So in 1937, the Nazi Party mounted an art show that they called the Degenerate Art Show, and that was not complimentary at the time. They exhibited all of the artists that they considered to be socially degenerate, and then they burned a lot of those paintings. There's a great documentary about that, where there's this amazing moment where this old man says, as a young art student, he went to this show because he said, I knew that this was the last time I would ever be able to see this work. So that group of painters were making very fearless work about trench warfare. A lot of them were World War I veterans. They were making extremely fearless social commentary about the aftermath of World War I on people's bodies, on the cities that they lived in, on the social fabric. So, of course, it was very sympathetic to sex workers. It was very queer, and of course, it is the exact opposite of fascist art.
Well said.
Big influence on me.
You had mentioned, I can't recall the artist, but you said, it was basically you took the painting and made...
Otto Dix.
Otto Dix. It reminded me of that saying, what did they say? Good artists borrow, great artists steal.
Who said that?
I don't know. It's one of those sayings that you hear all the time. But, Leela, I want to say your bibliography, as I was going through, which is a very comprehensive bibliography, I got to say. But some of the words I would use to describe it is like, your work is bold, you're unafraid of addressing difficult conversations about women's history, Jewish history, as well as like digging deep to, share with the world some very real and personal life subject matters, some very real and personal life, matters, dealing with trauma and suffrage. When you're working on projects like Unterzakhn, that require you to pull directly from, real life experiences and face trauma head on, how do you balance being in that mental space, but still having, a healthy personal and, a healthy personal and family life? Do you have like any rituals or routines in general that help you prepare or get like creatively charged?
I never need anything to get me creatively charged because I live my life that way, and I could talk about that, but I will say I spent most of the pandemic meticulously painting mass graves with a tiny brush, and it was it took a toll, and so I did institute some rituals around that during the darkest time, which for me was between the 2020 election and the inauguration. I felt like my intellect was under assault all the time, and I needed to protect it. So I recommend tuning into your own intellectual needs as well as your physical and emotional ones if you have the time, if you're lucky to have the space for it, and protect your intellect. What I did was I would turn the lights down in my studio, put on some very immersive music, and read exactly 2 pages of Johannes Eten's treatise on color theory, half of which is like the poetics of color, and the other half is completely incomprehensible to me. So half the time I would just be like, I don't even know what I'm reading, and the other half the time I would be completely enraptured. Johannes Eten was a teacher at the Bauhaus School who then fled the Nazis to the US, and he's one of the people who kind of formulated the color theory teaching pedagogy that a lot of us learn in formal art training. But this book is like, I didn't know this existed when I was in school. It's wild. But the other thing is I have a small child, and there's nothing better to pull you to the world of the living than other people to take care of, especially if they're young. Like, my daughter would run into my studio at the end of the day, and sometimes she would look at what was on my desk and be like, that guy's bleeding. What is that? That's gross. Or she would laugh, or she'd like act it out if it wasn't too bad. Or she would just ask me about it. And then she would just, she'd demand that I come out. She would start dancing to the music in my studio. She would entice me out to the living room. And I think also it's just really important if you are a working artist to just have a punch-out time. Especially, this becomes necessary and unavoidable, at least for me, as I got older. Like, there was a certain point where I couldn't take all-nighters anymore. So now it's like, okay, 6 o'clock, my brain switches into a different mode. It's caretaking other people, or just, turning into a blob on the couch, whatever the day demands, but not working.
I appreciate you sharing that. Assault on my intellect might be my new phrase I use going forward. That's pretty good.
Or your new post-hardcore band.
Now, you shared a little bit about your process, but I found something online where you went into a little more detail about your process. And there's a quote here that really spoke to me as an interviewer and someone who just puts a massive amount of unnecessary stress on preparing and, trying to reach this unattainable goal. but you said, quote, "The process involves a lot of humbling despair about the reality that I will never actually know enough about the time and place I've chosen to set the book in," end quote. In retrospect, can you point to one or however many of your bodies of work and confidently say, you know what, maybe I was a little too hard on myself. I think I did justice to that time period and that setting after all?
Not yet.
Not yet? Wow.
No. But I can say that I think I fulfilled the parameters that I set. And that's more important than having a nebulous, unattainable goal. Understanding how to create a container for your work. And if you're doing research-based work, that's doubly important because you'll never understand a time you didn't live in completely. You have to specialize a little bit.
Okay, well said. There goes my hope for that. I was hoping for a...
Well, no, but I'm giving it like a
no, it's real.
You know.
It's real.
Well, don't be too hard on yourself. That doesn't help. I mean, if it, like self-paralyzing... My mic is cutting in and out.
It doesn't like the word self-paralyzing, apparently.
Yeah, right. Well, I won't use
That's
it anymore.
a new word.
Self-attack does not help anyone's work.
All right, Leela, it's very apparent that graphic novels like Unterzakhn and is it Yarzat, I believe?
Yarzeit is the title of a short story.
Yarzeit. And then Book of the Dead, all pull from personal stories. I've read you say that comics has helped you find a way to talk about your family and their unspoken trauma and your mother's early immigration to this country. Have you ever shared your stories with your mother or family? Like, what do they think about your career as an artist?
Oh, I think they're big fans. I'm sorry that my grandfather and grandmother didn't live to see it, although they probably would have been like, why you do this? For what you need this? There's a little bit of like don't air the dirty laundry in front of the goyim thing going on even with my mother. So that probably would have been there with my grandparents. I want to be really clear. This book is a work of fiction. Everything about this is fictional. I'm like the only New York Jew whose family did not come through the Lower East Side. We all came after the war or on the other side of the family to Philly. So this is fictional. But the other stories you mentioned are autobiographical and nonfiction, other people's stories too.
Now you spent a majority of time teaching, I guess still do, teaching aspiring comic creators, so I wanted to kind of alter this question a little different. From the perspective of a professor and author yourself, what words of wisdom or advice would you give to readers and fans of graphic novels and comics to help them better approach, understand, and consume sequential storytelling? I think, I think in certain circles, sequential storytelling, first of all, sequential storytelling, I think is not the most common phrase that people know it. You know, you say comic books, and I think there's a certain mindset to it that it's like, it's not really that deep. But I think that assaults the fact that there's so many variations and methods to storytelling. Like, what advice would you give to readers of comics to, like, you know?
I'm really glad you asked that question because this is something I've been struggling with. Because on the one hand, I don't want to be a gatekeeper for anybody's reading experience, but I do find myself kind of frustrated with how easily people sometimes accept comics that aren't fully developed yet, either artistically or narratively. And I was having this conversation with Tom, my husband and the founder of Sequential Artist Workshop, who said that he wants people to learn how to read, become syntactical readers, which I thought was really interesting. Like, be literate in the language of comics, understand what you're seeing when you're reading a comic. So, okay, I think that's pretty much describes what I hope for. I also just think, I'm a cheerleader for anyone making or reading comics, so I don't want to tell anybody what to read. But I would love to see people seek out more serious comics. I think earlier in our discussion when we were talking about French comics, that was a thing that immediately landed with me, is how much serious subject matter is in those comics, in a lot of American undergrounds and post-underground especially. And I would like there to be more people who know that and read those comics. I mean, obviously there's self-interest in that because those are the kind of comics I make, and everybody wants to grow their readership, right? But also, like, if your thing is superheroes or like fun, cute YA comics or whatever, then that's great. Like, so this is where I'm sort of torn. It's like, there's what I want as an artist who makes very serious work for adults, and then there's what I want for people in general, which is to just enjoy what they like.
What are some examples, I guess, of that serious work or bodies of work to maybe help people understand what comic books are capable of in a more adult, mature, storytelling way?
Well, I'll name a few, and I'm going to reveal here also that the curse of the mid-career artist is you don't have a lot of time to keep up with what's new. So these will be slightly older books, and I bet people here will have other recommendations that are newer. Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters is a really good one. The entire body of Love and Rockets, but especially Gilbert Hernandez's Palomar stories, really all Jaime, like any Jaime. He's been getting very serious in the last few years, but that's consistent throughout his career also. The work of Linda Barry, Lauren Weinstein makes really amazing, serious work, and she's got more books coming soon. She's amazing. I mean, there's so much, it's kind of like hard to choose. I mentioned Phoebe Gleckner earlier. She hasn't been making comics a lot lately, but the work that she was doing in the 90s was like a touchstone for me. And serious, but also innovative in its artistic approach. I think that's really important too. I guess as a teacher, what I want to tell students, not readers, but students, is don't be content with the easiest way of making something. Push your formal boundaries as an artist. So as a reader, there's a version of that too. Go seek out the stuff that is artistically and technically innovative.
I guess on the topic of aspiring comic creators, because obviously we're in the right place for that. There's plenty of aspiring comic creators, doing wonderful work, and you yourself have been in. I've probably met more than I could probably count as far as creators and artists. And you just gave advice in terms of maybe like artistic advice, but from like the business aspect of it, like the business and commerce side of comics, what advice do you have for aspiring comic creators that want to make this like their full-time thing, that want to break into the industry? Like, do you have anything that you wish someone would have told you before entering into the world of being a published author?
There's nothing that I wish anybody had told me, because I think I've been really fortunate. And I'm very happy with where my career has been so far. But I can offer some wisdom from my years of doing it. First of all, comics happen in community. Nothing happens without community. Find your community. Second, never work on spec, ever. There's no good reason to ever work on spec. And let me be clear about what that means. Somebody says, I want to hire you, or they don't say I want to hire you. You pitch someone, or they reach out to you asking if you want to do a comic for them or an illustration or whatever. And they say, send me a finished draft or a full sketch, and then I'll decide. Don't do that. Your pencil does not hit the paper until there is a contract. Get everything in writing. That's 3. Never work for exposure. Don't work for free unless it's for charity or for friends. And then, use your judgment, but those things are good reasons to do it. Like really basic kind of workaday stuff like that. As far as breaking into the industry, I mean, I'm not sure I ever did. I think I took an alternate route.
What do you remember from what was the moment where you were like, yeah, I've got something here. Like, I can make this, something serious. Like, this is like I guess what was that, oh wow, I'm actually doing this moment for you?
I think I'm by nature very obsessive and single-minded when I want to do something, and I don't take no for an answer, and I tend to be kind of very intense about things I do. So I think as soon as I started making comics and started really enjoying it, it was just natural, like instantly, like, of course this is the thing I'm going to obsessively drive myself with until the bitter end. And I couldn't have predicted where it would end up, but the things that happened because I was also working in a community of people, those are the things that actually gave me the career that I have. The artistic drive is something else entirely, but those two things intersected at one point and just kept going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, community always at the forefront. I hear that a lot from some of the other artists I've interviewed as well, like the fact that they were able to lean on community to, get their work off the ground, to transfer those lessons learned, resources and things like that. I'm glad that you brought up a community being the focal point.
Well, yeah, also because the people who are in your community are the people who are ultimately going to be working as editors or art directors or fellow artists and fellow teachers, and you're going to give each other jobs and you're going to help each other along the way until death. Like, this continues till the end.
Well said. So I got one more question for you, and I think we can get to Q&A. I believe it was stated at the beginning that if anyone's got a question for Leela, there's a sheet of paper at the bottom or underneath your seats if you guys want to write those down. I think they're going to start collecting those questions now. But while they do that, Leela, there was a quote of yours from a talk that you gave at a college about the power of comics, which I was already like, the power of comics? Sign me up. This sounds like a great lecture. But you were addressing an attendee who thanked you for the inclusivity and diversity in your work. And you said, I know what it's like to not see yourself, and it's so powerful to see yourself represented. Do you think that is still... Do you think comics still has is achieving that goal of representation and allowing people to see themselves in the medium, or do you think there's still a lot of work to be done? And a bonus question to that, what comics or graphic novels come to mind, or creators, fellow creators, come to mind that are doing justice for inclusivity and diversity?
These are great questions, and I think it's readers who can give you the best answer about whether they feel seen and represented in comics. And people who work on the editing side and the green lighting and contracting side also need to be asked that question. What I have seen, generally speaking, is that comics only get better the more people are making them, and the bigger the table gets. Like, if there are more people coming to the table, make the table bigger, bring more chairs. As far as who is making the comics that are doing that work, I think there's so much more of that now than there was even a decade ago. And this is where I'm just going to fall short because, again, like, I haven't had time to keep up. But that's a good thing because that means there's just so much more stuff being made. So I can give you broad examples more easily. So I first went to SPX, Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland in 1998 when I was still in school. And then I went back. I went a few times after that. I didn't go for 20 years, and I went back last year for the first time, and it was a completely different festival. There were so many more queer creators. There were so many more creators of color. It was so much better. And all the work was amazing. So that to me says there's more people making great work now, and it is much more inclusive. It's much less white, much less male, which, like, we've needed that. It's like rain on parched earth. And I think also, from a teaching standpoint, the bedrock of my teaching pedagogy is that people's stories matter, and I start out by, I just think, like, people are told frequently, nobody wants to hear that. Why would anybody be interested in that? And this is like the thing that I'm teaching against because I hear that from students a lot too. Oh, I have this idea, I want to write this story, but people keep telling me it's not interesting, and they'll, okay, well, what's your idea? Oh, I want to tell this story about, and then they'll say like some family history or some amazing idea, you name it, of any genre. I'm like, that's amazing, like that has to exist. And the only person who can bring that into existence is that artist. So I think that is happening more in comics than it used to. But please ask readers that. Because readers are the ones who drive that and who can really say, yes, I feel seen when I open this book. Now, of course, like, not every book is for everybody, right? Like, there's specificity in what we make. It's the broadness and the amount of, again, I'm just going to use this silly metaphor, seats at the table that really matters. I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I love what you said, rain on parched earth. That was excellent. Let's give it up for Leela Corman, go. Thank you for taking my questions.
Thank you. Those were such good questions.
Thank you so much. I caught a few of them were caught by surprise, but I appreciate you.
Well, as Badr mentioned, we are going to open it up for audience questions. We already got some. We got some early birds. Love it. So if you have any, please write them down on your clipboards. If you're in our Zoom audience, go ahead and send it in the chat, and we'll write it down and get it over here. And if you've already written a question, but you come up with some more, we'd love to give you some scrap paper and write more.
Thank you so much. All right, let's get to these questions from the audience. First and foremost, what inspired you to create graphic novels?
As opposed to short comics, I had a big idea. It had to be long.
Short and sweet, I like it. All right, this next question. When did you first start getting into art? Can you recall, I guess, maybe your first attempt at creating art on your own?
I can remember the first time I have a conscious recall of drawing, which is just trying to depict a person when I was a toddler. I just always was this. I was never anything else.
Okay. Well, actually, no, I'll add to that question, because you mentioned earlier that you have a lot of traditional art inspirations that don't reside in comics, and I was curious to hear some of those. Like, who are some of these? I guess what other outside of comics? Where do you go to for inspiration? Who gives you inspiration?
Well, so you mentioned you used the word cinematic in talking about Unterzakhn. There's a lot of shared language between film and comics. Although, of course, they're different art forms, but I'm always asking myself, what would Pedro Almodovar do? And then I try to do that. Film really informs what I do a lot. Not just Pedro Almodovar. I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. Every single book of mine has an Easter egg reference to an early 80s underground film called The Forbidden Zone. I see some recognition in the audience. Also music. So, there's so much crossover between punk and comics and zines and rock and roll, and that was a huge part of my life. I really, there are specific musicians whose work really informs mine. And then there's some musicians I work with, too, as a collaborative effort with visuals and music. So I like to work in a really cross-disciplinary way. There's so many things. I was a dancer for a long time. That informed my work. Being a physical mover. Everything goes into my work.
You put it all on the table. All right, this next question. What comes first, character development or storyline?
That's a great question. I would say every idea begins with a single image, and it's usually of a person. And then I have to figure out who that person is, where they live, and who they live with. Sometimes it comes in the form of a very sort of hard to articulate idea that just grabs me. It's always something that grabs me and won't let go, an image or an idea. But often what comes to me first is the place and the time. So, I've been working on this book called Victory Parade since 2016. I just delivered it. It's done. set in Brooklyn in the 1940s, and it came out of just having this sudden, like, okay, I think I want to do a book about women working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the Second World War. And then it just spiraled from there, and a lot of other stuff happened. While I was in the middle of trying to write that book, I was in Germany, and I was sitting in a bar in Berlin, and I started thinking about being a kid during the Cold War, during the Reagan era, and immediately was like, God damn it, I think I have to do a book about that. So that's the thing I'm writing now, which is only partially about that, but that's how ideas come. It's kind of like, what's a good metaphor for this? Like, I'm given a little taste and then told that I have to eat the whole box.
I'll give you a 10 out of 10 for that metaphor right there.
Thank you. I was struggling.
What would you... what do you do when you hit like a roadblock, like a what do they call it, a writer's block or an artist's block? How do you overcome like just that halt in creativity? Do you step back, or do you have a ritual for overcoming that?
I would say I don't really experience it as a block anymore. There's a natural ebb and flow to making things, and I'm just very acquainted with that at this point. So I think because I already have other stuff that I do, I know I can just go do that. Like, okay, you know, I think I've hit a wall now with writing or drawing, whatever it was I was doing today. And man, the kitchen's really dirty. I'm going to go wash some dishes, or I'm going to go lift weights, or it's time to go pick my daughter up from school. Where this changes is when I'm in an environment where there's nothing for me to do but work, like if I'm at a residency. And this is a new part of my career, going to artist residencies, and the first time I went to one, I spent the first week crying because I was like, I'm not working hard enough, and they're giving me this beautiful studio and feeding me and pampering me, and I've got to get a certain amount of work done. And I was like, what? Stop. You can't do that. Like, you're not, you know, you're not a college student. Like, you're a professional. Like, you know how to handle yourself. Handle yourself. So what I did the last time was really helpful. I was at a residency where they gave me this beautiful, huge studio, and in one corner I had a drafting table, and in the other I had a huge piece of wall, and I would just go back and forth between the wall and the table. So if I was at the table, I was writing, and if I was at the wall, I was making a giant painting. Just having different things that you do and understanding that there's a restorative cycle to making art as much as there is to being alive. Like, you have a biological need for restoration. You need that as an artist as well.
Well said. Nothing to bring you back to reality than some chores, to your earlier statement about a dirty kitchen. All right, I like this this postcard, or this little card right here, because it's got three kind of bullet points. First, they write, first, you rock. And I totally agree. You do rock, Leela.
Thank you.
Secondly, as a teacher, when you have a student that you know can take it to the next level, but they aren't going there, how do you get them to go there? And then I'll give you this third one here too. Is there a place we can purchase your earlier autobiographical work?
Actually, the autobiographical stuff is more recent. So yeah, there's a book coming out this summer called You Are Not a Guest that has a lot of that work in it. And that's all comics I've done since 2016. That are largely non-fictional. In fact, actually, I think they're all non-fiction. As for teaching, I mean, it really depends on the environment. So it's my job at Rhode Island School of Design to push people because it's a professional track school. If I see at a crit that a student is working, I don't like to use the terms like below their potential. That was something that was lobbed at me when I was growing up, and I really hated it. I think it was damaging. You know, there's all sorts of techniques that teachers employ to encourage students to push themselves. That's all. It's pretty simple. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm stuck, and I feel like I could be doing more, then that's different, and that sort of escalates the conversation a little more, because they're asking for that help. And then I'll probably, what I usually do is talk to them. It's very individual. I try to devise exercises that will help them either go deeper into the thing they're trying to make or step away from it and make something that is completely different. So they can, sometimes what people need is to be given a break from what they're doing rather than shoved deeper into it. It's very, very individual. It really depends on the person.
Good answer. And good question, too. Thank you for that. All right, this next one. Do you do workshops? And if yes, where can we find them to sign up? And then the second question on here is, any advice on storyboarding a comic book, more specifically when you're the writer and not the artist?
On teaching workshops, yes. As far as how to sign up for them, it really, you can watch my Instagram. I try to post that information there when it happens. So if it's a public thing that's happening in a specific location in person, that'll be there. Sequential Artist Workshop is the place where I teach online the most often. And they're really easy to find. They're Comics Workshop on Instagram and sequentialartistworkshop.org, and they're here. Sometimes I teach 1 day or 4-week workshops there. To the final question, I actually really hate adapting other people's writing, and I don't do it anymore. I did it for a little while very early in my career, and I discovered that I was not good at it, so I don't have great advice on that. I'm sorry. But there is good information out there, and actually, you know what? I don't know. If Ask at the SAW table, there might even be some resources at SAW about working with adaptation, because that's a very specific skill set.
Well said. Okay, I got one last question from the audience here, and it is, how do you decide your narrative are for a graphic memoir? And I'll go ahead and maybe add a little bit to this question as well, because I imagine, you know, like many of us, I'm sure that you great ideas hit you, and you're like, but I think the difference is, sorry about that. So I think like many of us, great ideas must come to you. But the difference is you have the means to make ideas a reality, to bring them into the world through your art. I guess, how do you go about deciding which idea gets, you know, which one is the one to run with, to dedicate this time and effort to create a physical body of work?
Well, I'll bring it back to something I said earlier, which is that I always know when an idea has to be made into reality, because it will not let me go. Also, another way to know is if something makes me cry, or if I kind of like lose my breath for a second. And eventually, if you do that enough, if you attune yourself to your own signals as a creator enough, you will know exactly like when is this idea a good one, right? Also, sometimes you have to try it and just see what happens, and then you'll know if you're onto something while you're making it, and you will also know if it isn't something that is going to sustain your interest, because it won't sustain your interest. It's pretty simple, but you won't know unless you do it.
Well said. All right, we got a few more questions that snuck in. This one is, what advice can you give beginning writers about avoiding procrastination and staying focused on their project?
Set a time limit so that you have some structure. Like, I'm going to go to the cafe, and for 1 hour I'm going to just take random notes and do my research and take notes while I do that, or a half hour, whatever, or wherever it is you like to work. You know, I like to do some of my writing in cafes with a lot of ambient sound around me, so that's why I use that location. But for you, it might be totally different. It might be a carrel at a library. It might be your couch. Wherever it is, like, set a time limit, even set a timer, and see how far you get. And then don't beat yourself up about it. Just keep going back and doing it. And sometimes I have to say, you know, we live in trying to make art in capitalism is really rough. We live in a country that does not value cultural production. So we have all these ideas about productivity. There's a lot of capitalist and Puritan damage that's been inflicted on us as artists and creators and people, the language of productivity sometimes comes from that. So sometimes it's good to just understand that is happening, and that what someone might term procrastination might actually be you begging for a rest. Maybe you need to rest. Maybe you need to take a walk. Maybe you need to play with a dog. There's a lot that gets lost when we think of creating as simply a form of productivity. Very well said.
And a few of these questions are related to your process, and I think you've addressed that a few times already. So I'll give you one other question, because you brought up working with students, and we had the question about pushing them to meet their full potential, quote unquote. But can you recall a memory where a student inspired you? Maybe like you saw them approach a topic or a means of creating the comic in a certain way that you were like, that's pretty interesting. Or do you have any, I guess, not to play favorites, I'm not asking you to play favorites, but do you have any star pupils that you're like, wow, like I'm really proud that I got to even have a micro, influence on them?
Yeah, so I'll say, first of all, teaching has made me a much better artist. Second, hi, a couple of my awesome students. So some of my star students are in the audience, but they were stars already. I would say every time I teach, I have these experiences where I'm totally blown away by my students' approaches to problem solving all the time. Like, there's not one student that I've had who has not done something that's wowed me at least once, and often it's more than that. There's certainly, I can think of pieces over the years that students have done that stand out in my memory. There's so many. I could be here all day just listing them. I mean, God, if I were to make an anthology of all my students' work over the past decade, it would be, I think it'd be better than my work, and not that matters. It would just it would be amazing, and it would be very diverse in every way. I had a student at UF. I'm sorry. No, go ahead. I had a student at UF who I thought was not understanding the class at all, and then his final project was a shadow puppet theater that he made out of a cardboard box and some solder wire, where he performed the entire Trials of Heracles for the class. It was amazing. Another time I had a student in my pre-college class last summer who did this incredible silent piece in response to Roe versus Wade being overturned that was one of the most disturbing and beautiful comics I've ever seen, and I had to hide my reaction to it because it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to burst into tears in the middle of the crit. Wow. But I wanted to. So those are just two examples, but honestly, every single class I teach, that happens.
Wow. That's beautiful. That sounds like a very privileged role to be in, to be able to be surrounded by that on a consistent basis.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome.
It's a privilege to teach, and it's a privilege to be a working artist. All those things.
Well said. And I think that gets us through our audience Q&A. Leela, once again, I want to thank you so much for your time and taking the questions. Audience, thank you guys so much for the questions yourselves. Some solid ones in there. Let's give Leela a round of applause as we wrap up this year's
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Badr, for your amazing questions, and thank you all for being here and for your great questions, too.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.